Okay.
You know what? After you've read the story, let's make up our own minds if you would have wanted to live with them, okay? So I'm going to read from some of this for a little bit. So like we said, we studied the Northeast region of the United States. That's this region. And the Iroquois was a tribe that used to live there in abundance in this part of the United States before it was states, before there was Pennsylvania and New York and all these states. It was just land, it really wasn't set up as states or anything like that. It was just them. So this is called If You Lived with the Iroquois. That's how it's pronounced, Iroquois.
Iroquois.
It looks like Iroquois or something. It's Iroquois. All right. It's a long book. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to pick the most important parts. So here's our introduction. A little dark. Before there was a United States, there were hundreds of thousands, some say millions of people living on the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The most powerful in the Northeast, perhaps in the whole country, were the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. We know them as the Iroquois. So they have a couple of names. The original name is the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. We call them the Iroquois. The Great Iroquois League stretched from eastern New York to northeastern Ohio, and from northern Ontario to northern Pennsylvania. So just to give you an idea of how big their area was. So here's the map of the United States. So it said it stretched from
You're upside down.
From eastern New York. What did I do? There we go. I hit the wrong button. I was trying to turn off the light. So it went from eastern New York all the way out to Ohio, up from there to there, and then from up in Canada down to Pennsylvania. So it's a pretty big area. So the Great Iroquois League stretched from eastern New York to northeastern Ohio, and from southern Ontario to northern Pennsylvania. But the boundaries were loose. The Iroquois sometimes traveled as far west as the Mississippi River, as far south as Tennessee, and as far north as Hudson Bay. Okay, those are large distances. When we learn about their society, it seems very different from ours. But like all people, they fed, clothed, and housed themselves, educated their children, set up working government, played favorite sports and games, and had national celebrations. Like most people, they fought wars when necessary and hoped for peace. Many history books are about the Iroquois and the settlers, trade, the sharing of skills and knowledge, the spread of contagious diseases that killed thousands of people, wars, treaties, victories, and defeats. This book is mostly about Iroquois life before all that. It's about what it was like to grow up in one of the most powerful Indian nations in America's history before the colonists arrived. So here we see they lived in this area here, and this shows a close-up. You're going to find it was actually 5 tribes altogether: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Kiowa, and Seneca.
Yeah, I read about Mohawk yesterday on a book.
Yeah, it's very familiar. Which nations made up the Iroquois League? In the beginning, 5 nations made up the league: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Kiowa, and the Seneca. During colonial times, only the French called them the Iroquois. The British called them the 5 Nations, and they called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. Each nation also had a special name that related to where it lived. The Mohawk were the people of the Flint country because of all the flint rock in the earth. Within the league, they were also known as the keepers of the Eastern Gate, since they were the easternmost nation. The Oneida were the people of the Standing Stone, a great rock in Oneida country. The Onondaga were the people on the hills. Within the league, they were called the keepers of the council fire because they presided over the league council meetings. Whoops. The Kiowa were the people at the boat landing, or the people at the mucky land. Historians think this refers to marshland at Lake Cayuga. The Seneca were the people of the Great Hill and also the keepers of the Western Gate. In the early 1700s, the Tuscarora Nation, driven by settlers from its lands in the Carolinas, asked to join the League. They were accepted, and the British then called the League the Six Nations. Through peace treaties and war, many tribes came under the protection of the Iroquois. At one time, there were more than 60 other tribes that had joined the Great League. So the Iroquois, it's not just one tribe, it's a mix of different tribes. What was the Iroquois Trail? This is an interesting thing to think about. The trail was a path that ran through the forests and over hills, streams, and rivers between what are now the cities of Albany and Buffalo in New York State. It was sometimes thought of as the center aisle down the great longhouse of the Iroquois League. The path was wide enough for one person. It was a foot deep in some places, beaten down from so many footsteps. The trail connected the five nations. So, okay, if we look back here, there was like a path that walked through all the nations. You could walk it. And it wasn't very wide. Only one person, like you'd have to walk it single file. But it was been walked on so much, it was like a foot deep from getting worn down. So that's kind of amazing to think of. The Iroquois were famous runners, and a good message runner could travel 50 or more miles in a day. But the trail was not only used to send messages. People loved to travel, and they often visited relatives in other places. The trail was also part of a great marketplace. People living far from each other could travel and trade goods and supplies. The Great Trail was so well placed, the New York State Thruway today follows its path. New York State Thruway, what they mean is it's a big highway that goes through New York. So back to the map here. So here's New York. So this is kind of the main place where the Iroquois lived. And here's Albany, and here's Buffalo. And they said, so there was a long path that they could travel from there to there, and it kind of connected all the nations together. And you could travel it to visit people or to go do business. And it was such a well-placed path that now there's a highway that runs that way. Interesting to think about. Interesting question here. Did the Iroquois have a written language? No. They had what was called an oral tradition. Their great books weren't read, they were told by storytellers. Without a written language, you learn the history of your family, your village, your nation, the great language, the great league, and the world through storytelling. Because older people were highly respected, they were usually the storytellers. There were also storytellers who traveled throughout the land. They were always invited to stay in a village for a while. From their earliest days, children learned the old stories. Some grew up to be storytellers themselves. To be a great storyteller, you had to train your memory. Some legends, laws, and treaties could take days to recite. There were also hundreds of fables that could be told. They were fabulous tales about a race of little people who lived in the earth and were so powerful they could, what could they do? They were so powerful they could tear out the roots of an oak tree and use the tree for an arrow. About monster mosquitoes, stone giants, witches, and floating heads and that streamed through the forests. In the old tradition, the elders had a saying that you only told stories during the winter, not the summer, because people would stop work to listen. They said that birds, hearing the fables, would forget to fly, and all other animals would stop storing food for winter. In fact, the whole world would come to a halt because everyone loves to listen to a good tale. And if that happened, there'd be no corn, no beans, no squash, or other food to store for the long, cold months. And that's why, as the story goes, you should only tell stories in the winter. Interesting point. So then here's an example of a storyteller telling the kids the stories. Now imagine that if you wanted to know the history of your people, you didn't have any books to read or anything like that. You couldn't look it up on Google or anything. You had to sit and listen. And this person had it all up in his brain. He had it all memorized, all the history of the people and all the stories for the kids. So to be a storyteller took a lot of practice and talent. Did everyone speak the same language? Well, it's 5 different nations, right? Let's see if they did. The 5 nations spoke different dialects of the Iroquois language. Often they understood one another. Sometimes they didn't, but they were able to quickly learn each other's dialects since they shared a common language. So that word dialect means that you might both speak the same language, but depending on what part of the country you're from, your language might be slightly different. You might use a few different words, but generally it's kind of the same. So that's what a dialect is. It's just kind of a different versions of the same language. So the 5 nations had different dialects of the Iroquois language. A good example of that, we used to have a teacher that worked in our school at Frank Rushton, and she spoke Spanish. So she helped with kids who spoke Spanish, but she had a little bit of trouble. And here's why. She learned her Spanish while working in Argentina. And she said the Spanish they speak there, it's quite a bit different from the Spanish like up in places like Mexico, as if it's a different dialect. So she could understand them, but she would have a little bit of trouble sometimes. So that's what they mean by dialects. So let's get back to the book. That I wonder if anyone's actually listening to me. Is anyone listening? I don't know. Throughout New York State and parts of the Midwest, we use Iroquois names for different geographic places. Schenectady, Genesee, Oswego, what's that word? Canajoharie, and Ohio, for example. Other Northeast Indian words, some Iroquois, some Algonquin, such as porcupine, wampum, and raccoon, have also become part of the English language. So there's lots of words that come from Native American languages. Kansas comes from Native American language. What was wampum? Beads cut from seashells were called wampum. Indians living in eastern Long Island were the original wampum makers. They supplied the beads to the Iroquois. Most often, the Iroquois used purple, white, and black beads. Some people think wampum was used like money. In the old days, before the Europeans came, wampum was never used for money. The Iroquois used the beads to make strings and belts that had special purposes. The beads were woven into different picture patterns. Wampum strings were used to the condolence ceremony, the religious ritual performed when someone dies. Messengers always carried wampum strings or belts. When they showed the wampum, the listener knew the messenger's words could be trusted. It was as if by carrying wampum, a messenger had taken an oath that he was speaking the truth. What other ways was wampum used? The Iroquois also used wampum belts to record important information and great events. The founding of the League, the laws governing the League, treaties with other nations, and other stories. The great collection of wampum belts was kept by the Onondaga Nation, who are called the wampum keepers. The story of the creation of the League and some treaties are as long as 200 or 300-page book. They take days to recite. It is said that the designs on certain wampum belts represent these stories and treaties. On special occasions, the belts are read aloud. The designs help the person reciting to remember all the words. Okay, a couple more pages here. Where would you live? Remember, their name was Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. Well, look at the houses. Pretty accurate, huh? You lived in a village often built on high ground and surrounded by an oval-shaped stockade. The stockade was made of logs about 20 feet tall. You entered through an opening where the logs overlapped. Farm fields surrounded the village. Inside the stockade, there were rows of buildings. Most of the buildings were longhouses, and that was your home. So if you look, this is the stockade, a wall around it. You see there's a spot there where you come in, and then there's farmland all around. And then there's the longhouses. What was a longhouse? A longhouse was just that, a long house. It was made of upright logs and cross poles and covered with elm bark. The longhouse had a carved roof of saplings bent over from one side of the longhouse to the other. There were no windows, but there were fire holes along the center of the roof that let out smoke from cooking fires. The longhouses were 15 to 20 feet high and 150 feet long, depending on how many families lived in one. 150 feet is half the length of a football field. So these are pretty long. It was easy for a new family to move in. You just added an extension to the end. What did the inside of a longhouse look like? When you lifted the bark door attached to the top, you looked down a center aisle all the way to the other end. This aisle was about 8 feet wide. Just inside the door, there were food storage barrels and stacks of firewood. At the far end of the longhouse was another storage area. On either side of the center aisle were compartments about 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. You and your family would live in one of these. The compartments were separated from each other by skin or bark partitions, sometimes made into closets. Okay, and so the inside, well, let's just finish this here. Wooden platforms for storage and sleeping lined the walls of each compartment. Some closets had sleeping bunks for little children. You sat and slept on corn husk mats and covered yourself with deer or bear skins. Each family had its own cooking utensils, bowls, spoons, bows and arrows, clothing, blankets, and other items. Most things were stored in baskets and bags under the bunks. Fires were lit in shallow pits in the center aisle. Your family cooked there and shared the fire with the family on the other side of the aisle. So that's what it would look like inside a longhouse, long aisle with a door at the end. So that's the start in learning about the Iroquois. So we got like 3 minutes till we meet with Miss Garcia. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the meeting now. And I won't see you guys till 3:45. Hopefully some of you come back. Hopefully all of you come back. There's hardly anybody here now. Bummer. So, all right. So see you at 3:45.